Hi, and welcome to Finding Your Way Through Therapy. I'm your host, Steve Bisson. The goal of this podcast is to demystify therapy, what can happen in therapy, and the wide array of conversations you can have in therapy. I also talk to guests about therapy, their experience with therapy, and how psychology is present in many places in their lives. I also share personal stories. So please join me on this journey about therapy. Hi, and welcome to episode 80 of Finding Your Way Through Therapy. I am Steve Bisson. If you haven't listened to episode 79, please do so. It was my favorite episode. It was with Courtney Romanowski and Stephanie Simpson. We also have a free PDF file that you can download on breathing and the benefits, as well as some exercises that you can do. So hope you do that. And that handout is part of the 12 Days of Christmas. Episode 80, or day 8 of the 12 Days of Christmas, is the most downloaded episode of the year. No surprise here, it was Mr. Pat Rice. Pat Rice is a friend of mine, known him for a long, long time, and he wanted to come on to my podcast, and he wanted to talk about his near-death experience. And it was an amazing conversation. It's from January 19th, 2022, and this is episode 32, and I hope you enjoy it. Episode 32 will be with Pat Rice. Pat Rice is someone I've known in the area, my mentor, talks about him highly. He also is someone that I've really admired and enjoyed talking to for many years. Pat Rice is 73 years old. He is clean and sober for 35 years and has been practicing psychotherapy for over 31 years. He works with dual diagnosis and does a lot of mental health treatment, but we're going to talk a lot about spirituality, hopefully, because that is the goal and how his near-death experience has played a factor in his treatment. And I'm a big fan of Buddhism. I hope we get to talk about that, and I will let you listen to the episode. Hi, and welcome to episode 32 of Finding Your Way Through Therapy. I am Steve Bisson. I got to tell you today, I am honored and touched by the presence of someone I've known for a long time, my history. And the one who you've heard me say on this podcast several times, he's the one I refer to when I say there's only 3 original ideas in the world. He's the one who told me that, and I always remember that. So, Pat Rice, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Steve. It's an honor to be here.
Pat, it's funny because we've known each other for a while. I think it was this is our first time really sitting one-on-one with each other, I think, since I've known you. And I've known you for like many years.
Yeah, formally, other than idle or consultations and things like that, where we shared ideas and helped each other. But yeah, it's the first time. As I said a little earlier, probably the first of many.
Well, I'm hoping it's going to be the first of many because I've known you for a while. Who I consider my mentor is a gentleman who talks highly of you, and to this day, now that we've been together for 20 years or so, he says, "I'm not your mentor. We're colleagues." I'm like, "You're still my mentor." So I'm sure you understand that because we're going to talk about a little spirituality today. And I think that mentorship has to do with spirituality also and kind of like bringing that in. But before we go down that path, so to speak, maybe you can tell me more about yourself, Pat, because I know who you are, but maybe other people don't.
Well, we know each other by fact we're both psychotherapists, and we've been at it a long time, and we were trained by the same guy, actually, as students. And the connections go back for the audience. Steve and I are part of a group, peer supervision group, that has literally been going on for 30 years. And obviously, the cast has shifted with time, and people come in when they need it and exit when they don't require it anymore to keep themselves grounded. But in and of itself has been one of the great grounding agents for my practice. And it's been really important as I'll get into as we go farther as to how my practice has shifted. But a little bit of background on me is that I've been a psychotherapist for 30 some odd years. I've been clean and sober, which is what started this journey, almost 36 years. I'm almost 74 years old. And I don't see any reason to stop now until the vehicle slows me down. Or as I say, a patient says for the second time, you fell asleep again. So, but I had many jobs. I don't talk about this much, but when I got out of school, I intended to do this originally. And I got distracted by other work pursuits and self-employment. I was a professional photographer, self-employed, some of the creative stuff. And I did a whole bunch of careers for 2 years each until I got bored with it. And then addictions, chemical addictions caught up to me. And when I finally needed to deal with those, I chose, after some healing, to return to my roots. And 20 years after I began, I finished a master's degree, literally 20 years to almost to the day. It's really eerie because it was an August graduation, as it turned out. But what started this journey for me, and which I will get into as we go forward, and what has shaped my non-traditional now career and focus. But what started this was that you hear people sometimes in recovery that say, I got here the day before I died. I got here the day after I died. Basically, was in a 2-day coma, and I'm gone. And I went to another place, and the place from which we come, and I'll talk more about that. But I had a near-death experience, of which I was not aware initially until I was in treatment, and someone sitting next to me, a 17-year-old boy. I was 30, just turned 38. A 17-year-old young man spoke about this experience, and as he was speaking, I knew exactly what he was going to say next. And so that has certainly shaped my motivation, it shaped my focus. And as I have evolved in my own work, my own healing, and then my own evolution, and the shamanistic work that I have been doing, and really it's mostly what I do now, more and more people were led to me. As I've said many times, probably to every student I've had grad students, the privilege of grad students for about, 20 some odd years, is that it's the old, if you build it, they will come. And people, I have never looked for a job in this new incarnation. I have never looked for a job. I have never looked for patients. They find me. And the people that I'm supposed to help find me. And the ones that are able to be helped find me. And that's the nature of it. And I would preface, I told Steve, you should warn people that this is not a traditional psychodynamic psychotherapy kind of dissertation or discourse. I'm the woo-woo guy. And when I worked in a hospital-based system, if someone, and this actually happened once, a woman called up the switchboard and said, I need to talk to someone in psychiatry. And they said, about what? Well, I'm either psychic or psychotic. And they go, Pat Rice, you need to talk to Pat Rice. It's the truth. And she was not psychotic. She was definitely psychic, which is an interesting story I could share at some point.
But maybe that's where I would like to go, Pat, because told us about, I want to get to the near death experience, obviously, and that's not going to change. But you became a psychotherapist, and you don't just get up one day and say, oh, I'm a psychotherapist, number one. And number two, you don't go from psychotherapist to the evolution that you've become without having a few steps on the way. And I know a little bit about your work in the hospital and all that, but I'd like to hear more about that.
Okay, well, I'll explain where the seed was planted the second time around. When I was in the last stages, that's maybe the last few weeks, it was winter, and I'm strolling. I was living in Yarmouth, Maine, a beautiful coastal town in which I lived for quite some time. And I was wandering on a snowy night like Ebenezer Scrooge and down looking in windows of people having normal lives. And I stood outside of one window, which was a business. It was a psychotherapy practice of an LICSW. And a nice little, and I just felt myself being in that. And so a short time later, when I overdosed and then went into treatment, and I came out of that, and I came back to Massachusetts to get help because that's where the family halfway house was, people that were sober and resources. There were no resources in Maine for people that had very little. And so I was fortunate, and when I always intended to go back to Maine and have a practice in that office, honest to goodness. But one thing leads to another, and you get people put in your path, and a mentor put in my path, an extraordinary man, a theologian, a chaplain, someone that became a recovered mentor and a life mentor, and probably the smartest man I ever knew. And as Steve would probably agree, that when I don't know what to do next, I channel him. That I just become him. You can become Dennis. We all can become Dennis. I can do Dennis. I won't. But it was. But we're gifted to be trained by people who, by giving us their their expertise and their nuggets. They help keep it moving on. It's the only thing we owe someone that gives freely to us is to pass it on. That's kind of what life is really all about. So, at about the time I was shifting away from a more traditional psychotherapy practice, I was involved in a shamanistic teacher who I still have today, now lives out west. And thank goodness for Zoom. But she was helping me to see that the guides were telling me, I'll get into the guides at some point here, but they were telling me that I needed to be more authentic. That was the word. And not get so much in my head and start to do psychotherapy, start to do counseling, start to do this mentoring from the heart. And as we learn now, I have a friend I work for her. She was the director of behavioral health, one that's been in our peer group, Mary. And she actually is I think she has a PhD in the consciousness of heart. I think that's what she studied. And, we know that the heart has its own, when people get heart transplants, and a student of mine died, and she was a young woman that ran the marathon and died of hyponatremia 4 days after getting her health psychology doctorate. But her heart was put into a young 15-year-old. And when I met this girl 2 years later, I said, you have an amazing heart. And she said, yes, I know. I said, are you different now? She said, oh, yes, I am. And when people get an organ, especially a heart, they take on a lot of the personality and the spirit that was the person that gave them the heart. I mean, God, having a heart transplant, that's a spiritual experience, if anything is. But
absolutely,
it was, yeah. That's one of those magic moments when she allowed Cynthia Lucero was the girl that died, when she let her mother hear her daughter's heart.
Whew. Wow, that must have been a very powerful moment.
It was this was at a fundraising thing, a run, obviously, and there were about 300 or 400 people in the room, and there was not a dry eye.
I bet.
It was really very powerful. But this was about the time I was awakening to this and being basically, I wouldn't say ordered, that's not how it works, guided to be more authentic with what I knew and stop getting with my head, but start leading with my heart. And that's when all of what I realized I had known, and most of what I had mined, now I began to mine what I had learned in the near-death experience. And I'll speak to that. Interesting, when that woman came into my office, I used to have a role in the hospital of, I trained people in psych triage in the emergency room, but I had a couple of slots for people that didn't qualify, didn't need to be medically cleared, didn't need an emergency room. And so every week someone could just assign me, and I had these slots. And she showed up on a Tuesday afternoon at 1:30 for this. And I said, how may I help you? Well, as I told the person on the phone, I meet the psychic. My husband thinks I'm psychic. I think I'm psychotic. And in 5 minutes, I knew she wasn't psychotic. And she was talking about her mother that everybody called a witch. And I just know stuff my whole life. She's 42 years old. My whole life, I've just known stuff about people. I don't want to know this stuff about people. It's really annoying. But she says, I think now there's something that is telling me that it's time to kind of discover this. And she was there. And so what she needed, she was leaving the next day. And 2 days later, she was moving to the Connecticut area. And she said, I need someone that can help me with this. I had a student that lived in Connecticut, a former student, and I hooked her up. I said, come back tomorrow and I'll have someone for you. And we'll just follow up on this interview. I want to see someone 2 times before I make a determination that they aren't in some kind of state of internal disarray. So, but before she left, she said, is there any reason there should be a cross floating above your head? And I'm thinking, huh? What? And I go, I don't think of it. No, she said, that's really, okay, yeah. Anyway, she kind of went, dissociative on me a bit. And then she left. The next day she showed up. I had a therapist named for her. It was a short appointment, which was exactly the same. And she said, thank you. You've been very helpful. And is there any reason there should be a priest standing next to you? And I looked next to me. I had to look. There's no one there. And she said, yeah, do you know a priest? I said, well, my mentor was gravely ill. He was in St. Patrick's Manor at the time. He was a Dominican. He was a chaplain. He was a theologian and a psychologist. He had more degrees than, gosh, he was amazing. But I mentioned his name, and Dick Fleck, Father Fleck. And she said, that's him. He's standing next to you. I said, is he gone? She said, no, most of him is on the other side, but he's still there and he needs you to come see him. And so I said, I can go tomorrow, the next day. And she said, good. And she left. She said, thank you. And she said, and you go see him. I don't want him bugging me anymore. So, it's a true story. And the next day I go to St. Patrick's Manor. I hadn't been there in quite some time. I had been remiss. It was painful for me to see Dick so ill. And he had another series of strokes. He recovered from a bunch of strokes. And, oh God, he recovered wonderfully. And then you get 10 years later, got a second that really debilitated him. And so I went in, and the person behind the desk who I knew said, you. He said, finally, you're the last one on the list. And everyone else that he wanted to see has come to see him. I said, okay. So I knew my way. I came around. He was asleep. He looked great, really. He was sleeping. For a minute, I thought he looked like he was basically laid out in the bed. And I knocked on the door, and he woke up. And this is what he said. He said, Patrick. He said, I have been sending the Holy Spirit for days to bring you to me. And that's where it begins. So I pulled up a chair. I said, well, if that's the case, if I got a story for you, I could tell you 100 stories like that. And that's how this kind of originally was studying to be a nuclear physicist. No kidding. I really was. I thought I was a prodigy until I hit a slump in advanced calculus and thwarted me into the human services or the lighter sciences. But one by one, and when he first became ill, I took over some of the groups he was running. And one of them was early on, one of them was a young woman who had died 11 times. She was only 23 years old. She had a bad heart. And she started talking in this group. And one by one, I realized the group was mostly people that had near-death experiences. And that's kind of how it started. I became open. And by watching others, and as patients would come to me and tell me about their experiences and people that they had benefited from, mediums and whatever, I get curious. And so I started going to all those people and just checking them out. I mean, I won't refer someone to an acupuncturist that I haven't tried. That's kind of where we talk a lot about that. I really want to have an experience with someone and not just a name. So I started getting really curious. And I think it's someone by the name of, I don't know why it's coming to me, Mike Dooley. I think he's an author, but the quote that comes to me, the sentiment is that mystery prompts discovery. And I've told more people, I said, my whole job as a psychotherapist here or as a healer, a healthcare provider, is to get you curious. There's a heurism to this, to get people curious about, no, you want to know more about this. Do your own research. This is your journey. Don't look for somebody else to give it to you. That's, as you know, the Buddha said that you have to walk the path.
And I think that's the stuff that really, I'm sharing a little bit of my own story. I grew up in a Catholic family. And as I say today, I'm a recovering Catholic. And when I started my career as a psychotherapist, mental health counselor, whatever you want to call it, I was scientifically based. I was like, no, this woo woo stuff. And by the way, woo woo does not offend me when people say I'm woo woo. Some people say that that's diminishing what we do. I really don't care personally. But eventually it can't be just that. And I remember having those moments. And one of my favorite moments that I share with someone is I had a client come in who was having the hardest time staying sober, and they might have had some legal issues over their head because of that. And I had a little Buddha I was exploring Buddhism, and I had Buddha on my desk, and he's like, who's that? I said, that's Buddha. And he talked a little bit about it. He's like, can I take it? I said, is it going to help you stay sober? And he's like, yeah. I'm like, all right, have him. And he stayed sober as long as I met with him. So that was a few weeks. So it's not like I know that he's been sober for 27 years or anything magical. But just talking about the spirit of Buddhism and how it works made him shift, and it made me shift. It's one of my stories that I share, that it made me shift that, all right, Steve, maybe you got to stop being so damn scientific and try to think about the things that are more than scientific. And spirituality, to me, if you don't talk about spirituality as part of your psychotherapy, mental health counseling, whatever you want to call it, I think that you're disserving your clients. I don't force it on anyone, but obviously most people who have known me, if they've walked in my office once, there's Buddha all over the place, and there's hockey stuff, but that's just a different religion in Montreal. But I think that when you talk about that, I think that awakening, those moments, are what really gets us to the other side. You had your own near-death experience, and now that I know a little more about the Dick story, because I've known about Dick, I've never met Dick. Obviously, he's no longer of this world, at least physically. It's interesting to hear, because that's all I could think of, is that he was a spiritual guide for so many people, and a lot of people like Dennis Sweeney that we know. And sorry, Dennis, to name you by name, and Mary Mullaney, and hope you're enjoying your retirement, because she just retired. Uh, how do we connect with the spirituality when we are sometimes so based on like science or doing that stuff?
Well, the science, it's really quite simple. The science is the head stuff, and the spirit is the heart stuff. And the three-dimensional world in which we live, four-dimensional world of time, is one where we focus a lot on the head stuff and not so much on the heart stuff, and where we overthink things. We've heard the paralysis of analysis, where people just get stuck, and especially men. I'm okay. I just need to think this, out. And I almost never quote Freud and Jung and Adler and those folks in my practice, but I quote Einstein almost every day, because Einstein said, "You can't solve a problem with the same mind that created it."
Right.
And we deal with people that just get stuck in up here with the, forgive me, I think this is original. I call it the itty bitty committee. And I wasn't going to use profane language, but it's
no one's
it's,
listening. Don't worry about it.
I know that is original, but that is when the mind won't shut down. And it's as a matter of fact, this wonderful man, Dick Fleck, he used to say, and I've seen this, as a matter of fact, they gave someone a 25-year anniversary medallion Sunday in AA. Someone I did an intervention on actually 25 years ago. But she said, "I don't know why I came. I don't know what drew me there. I didn't want to be there. I didn't want this. I sort of knew what was going on, but I came anyway." And what he used to say, Dick used to say, is that there's a very special form of prayer. It's not the head type of prayer where we ask for things and, just get me out of this mess and I'll never do it again type of childlike prayer, which is to ask for something or ask for an outcome. He said there's a special form of prayer, which is virtual prayer, which is when your heart is actually petitioning the divine, whatever it is, the universe, the higher power. The divine, being a recovering Catholic, I shy away from the male dominant language of God and all of that. I'm probably more okay with goddess than God, but why don't we just talk about, I talk about a higher power, whatever it is. He said that the heart actually asks for the help, and that's what sustains it, because the heart is far more powerful than the head, and it grows, and the heart is where the divine energy, the divine power, whatever, opens it up and can overcome all of that stuck thinking and all of that. In the recovery circles, we talk about a higher power, when the first sentence in the whole step process is we admit powerlessness. So I always say I didn't come into a recovery program looking for a theology. I had a similar background to yours, in which I learned early on, at least that from the catechism that I was taught, that the higher power, if you will, the God of my understanding, was one that taught heaven was essentially unattainable and hell unavoidable. It didn't seem to make sense to me. But the minute I started reading, in a very young age, I learned about karma, and I read something I actually read an entire encyclopedia. We had an encyclopedia, and I was
a physical one. I thought you used Wikipedia for this.
No, we had as I recall, it was the Collier's Encyclopedia, and I read it all. I just would read it, and I was curious, and some things wouldn't interest me, and other things really did. Buddhism did, and the whole idea of karma and reincarnation, but the karma, the fact that things balance out. Because I would see people that were not nice people, the pious people coming back, the daily churchgoers or whatever that would steal from paper boards. These types of people. That just didn't make sense to my little thoughtful mind, as I was a paper boy and would walk miles and miles pondering the universe and all these things. And so as I got more curious about it, it just made sense to me where other things didn't make sense. And I tried a bunch of different disciplines. The other thing is that I hadn't found a formal religion that actually embraced meditation. It was almost always the Eastern philosophies that embraced meditation, chanting and meditation and all of that, which seemed to work for me. Certainly, it helped to quiet the wild mind, the chanting and the meditation, the breath work. So these are the things that kind of opened me up to being curious and want to explore more about this, and which was to explore more about me. I think most of us go to graduate school to figure out how can a really smart guy like me end up so messed up. Got it. So.
Well, it might be a good transition. Again, just a reminder to everyone, we're listening to Finding Your Way Through Therapy. I'm sitting here with Pat Rice. My name is Steve Biso. It might be a good transition to start talking about the near-death experience, because we just talked about the spiritual stuff. And it might be helpful for people to understand. And sometimes we use the acronym NDE for that, as I pondered that question this morning. But maybe you can tell me more, because that, when you shift to more of a spiritual side, maybe you understand a little more, or you're more closer to your heart in what happened with a near-death experience. So can you tell me more about that?
Well, they're very different. If someone is really curious about a really well chronicled one, I've read everything written about near-death experiences, which I started after I had realized that I had one. And because it all came flooding back, as it often does in vulnerable people in group psychotherapy. Somebody mentions something and someone else gets flooded, and all of this repressed memory comes back. And
flashbacks, as we call it.
Yeah. As they say, as a great master once said, never underestimate the power of repression. What we can tuck away because it's just too painful to deal with. But when it comes flooding back, you really hope it's in a place where there are people to help you from drowning in, because it can overwhelm people. But I started getting really curious about this, and I read everything. A lot of books by Ray Moody, who was the first physician to really do it, a psychiatrist, and then Brian Weiss, another psychiatrist, who said, I want to jeopardize my entire Harvard and Yale career by writing about this. But there's an extraordinary book by I think he's a I think he's brain surgeon, Eben Alexander, Eben Alexander. And he wrote several books, but one of them, and gosh, I can't remember the title of it, but anybody can Google it. And I heard him actually speak in Sudbury over there.
Oh, really?
Once. Yeah. And,
Sudbury, Massachusetts.
Sudbury, I was actually sitting next to Chris Gordon, who was a wonderful psychiatrist who just retired as well. And he was speaking about his book. And I think he actually used to be a member of this synagogue in Sudbury, the synagogue right across from the mosque on Route 20. I love that. Yeah. And he spoke about it, but he wrote a book literally about this heaven, something about heaven. He remembered every detail, the sounds and everything. And it is profound. And it's a great read. And if anyone's just curious about it, as I'm always saying, get curious and just read it. And this is by literally a guy that operates on people's brains, and he had a bad day and it came back. So it has a lot of credibility to it. And the more people like him share the story, the more others do. Tons of the near-death experiences that I was witness to or listened to happened were written by physicians who had just witnessed all of this. ER docs, ER nurses, they hear this all of the time. I'll give you one, okay, where it really awakened me. When I did one of Dick's groups early on, when he went out for his first operation or whatever, and there was a young woman, this woman that died 11 times, okay, in a series of a couple of heart surgeries.
Same woman you were talking about earlier?
Earlier, yes. She was a young woman, and she had a captivating story, but she got angry at one point and telling the story. She said because it was a doctor that didn't believe her, one of the surgeons, didn't believe that she had had. And she said, "Well, yeah, I watched you." And she started telling him all about the surgery. And he said, "Who told you that?" And she said, "Well, I was floating. I was really up in the ceiling. I had out of body or what. I was just watching you work." And he said, "Well, when you start talking about brain hypoxia and you have these hallucinations and all of this." And she said, "Listen," he said, "if you're really interested about it, when I was up there, I noticed that there was a gold, what were those pens? Cross pen up in the
Okay.
light fixture. Someone must have tossed it up there. There's a gold pen up there. If you don't believe me, go find the pen." And okay. And she said later on, she got a phone call from the doctor. He said, "That worked on me for about 3 weeks, and they got maintenance to go up there and they retrieved that pen. Please forgive me." Because only if you were above the light fixture, would you
You
see the
couldn't see
pen.
it otherwise. Yeah.
That's right. So, but again, I've hundreds and hundreds of people have come to me and shared these stories. And as they do, as it happens, we collectively identify, and I start to then pick up pieces of my own story. And I've done a lot of work in this shamanistic, if you will, for lack of probably a better term, is that my guides have told me a lot. I've learned. I've done some regressive therapy and gone back a number of lifetimes and learned what I needed to learn. Had to go back to York, England, and settle the karmic debt. And I think that made a believer out of my wife because she was there witnessing this. And she's now a practicing Buddhist at the Zen Center in Rhode Island. And so it's you don't meet anybody by accident in all of this. I don't believe synchronicity and everything. As more people started to share these things, and I started to get curious about my own past. And it's funny, there's a certain amount of utility to knowing about that. And then I basically, there was one gap. I didn't know anything about the last lifetime. And all I was able to discern, based on what I was told, is that all you needed to know from that lifetime is you did not survive your alcoholism. So you had to come back and do it again.
I was going to
And
say, we
never,
repeat what we need to
yeah,
heal, right?
that's it. And then, so this time, and many of these guys, some of whom are actually ancestors of mine, said, "Yeah, you don't know how hard we work to keep you alive, so you could fulfill yourself and do what you're doing now." And again, I'm not. This is not self-promoting or whatever. I don't have anything to promote other than this concept that we're here for a greater good. And the thing that the template of sensibility about this existence that makes the most sense to me is Buddhism. Because the Buddha, basically, the tenet of that is to practice loving kindness, just be helpful to people and do no harm. That's the whole meaning of it, is that give it away. If you share your light gets more powerful. And, I'm a Reiki practitioner, which is just an energy healing and a divine energy healing. I don't use it hands-on very rarely. It certainly never fit into my clinical practice as it does for some people, because I worked a lot with trauma victims, and that was just initially that was just too tricky for me. But I use this energy, this ability. I see auras, I see people's energy fields very clearly, which makes Zoom a challenge for new people. Unless they're with somebody, I generally, when I do an interview, I want someone that knows them well because I can sense the energy better with the two of them. But it's basically all the same stuff. It's how if you do Reiki for somebody, you get Reiki. You're a channel. You're just a host, and you benefit from it. Not that it isn't,
Right.
that it isn't draining in a way, but it is enlightening, and it is enervating in a very powerful way. And
As
I'd say,
as one of my teachers said to me, I think about Reiki, about healing you, but more importantly, it's the energy of the universe. I lose nothing. It's the energy of the universe, because I'm a Reiki practitioner too. So what I've always reminded people, they're like, "How are you feeling?" So, well, other than having trouble keeping my arms up for a while, sometimes, really
yeah,
feeling great. I mean, I always feel great after a Reiki session.
yeah,
And I want to make sure that everyone knows you're absolutely right. That's not for everyone. And I know for some people, Reiki is challenging or difficult. But when you're able to channel Reiki, and you talked about Zoom, distance Reiki does exist, and
Oh my goodness,
certainly I've done
yes.
that. I've done that myself. So
Well, let me tell you an interesting story. Larry Dossey was a physician who's written a bunch about these things. He was a tough still. He tells a story in one of his books about someone who was doing a couple of docs that talked. One was on the West Coast, and they were doing a study on heart medication for really chronically some kind of congestive heart failure type thing. So they had 500 people in a study. And his pal, who was a member of a religious community or some kind of a prayer community in Texas, said, "Can we do our own experiment? Can we pray for half of these people?" And this is documented that, yeah, they had this group in everybody got in the prayer group got a name, a first name and a last initial of someone. That's all. And they prayed for this person. And at the end of 6 months, they were crunching the numbers on both studies. One was a double-blind medication trial, and then the prayer study. And the results were striking in one regard, is that the medication didn't seem to have a whole lot of effect on the outcome versus placebo. But the people who were prayed for had half the mortality rate, and on and on and on. It was so dramatic that they couldn't ethically not pray for everybody. And at the end of the
right.
year study, everyone had the same, that were prayed for had the same rate of mortality and blah, blah, blah. So there's a lot of evidence out there. It's one of the first applications of this prayer actually work. Well, I remember a grad student once petitioned me at UNH, petitioned me among many people through the association to her dissertation was on, do you teach the concept of forgiveness in psychotherapy? Many of us, when we actually looked at it, we actually do, because if you hang on to resentment and all that, and you can't forgive people that have harmed you or hurt you or wounded you, you can stay in a form of your own victimization. The Buddha said resentment is when you pour poison for somebody else, but drink it yourself.
Right.
Most of the stuff that rattles around in AA halls and 12-step recovery halls is all Buddhist wisdom. We steal our good stuff, and as Dick used to say, if you steal from one person, it's plagiarism. If you steal from everybody, it's research. And that's the truth. Everything here, nothing of this is new, but we're awakening to it. And I remember having literally a rocket scientist in my office, a nice gentleman who was sober, and he couldn't quite get past this. He was essentially believed an atheist because of his scientific training. And he said, I just can't get this higher power stuff. It just doesn't. It's not that it doesn't appeal to me. He said, I just can't get my mind around it. And I said, well, okay, it's just energy. It's just power. And I said, how about we call it dark energy? And he goes, whoa. He said, that'll work. I said, 2/3 of the universe is dark matter and dark energy. Matter, it becomes energy becomes matter. It's all the same stuff. You can call it grace, you can call it prana, you can call it kundalini, you can call it Reiki.
Right.
It doesn't chi. It doesn't matter what you call it. It's still there, and we just need to access it. Why? Because most of the people that come into my office are not mentally ill. They're not psychiatric over the years. They are dispirited, they are down, they are drained, and very often, and that's what group stuff does, is it helps to charge up that spirit battery. I watched a 3-year-old child walk into a room that had 8 brain injured, Wernicke's encephalopathy, wet brain, alcoholic men between 50 and 65 years old. It was actually a recovery AA meeting, and she was the daughter of someone that I knew. Her name was Grace. You can't write this stuff. And little Gracie came in looking like pebbles, a little hair up in ponytail. And one by one, and these men were very blunted. I was sitting with a grad friend of mine. We're in grad school together, and watching these men. They were very blunted in their affect. They're just like dead, as it happens when they're very demented. And one by one, Gracie would take the hands of each of these men, and they lit up like a lighthouse. To this day, I don't think I've seen something more powerful. And then we had 8 men who basically were just dead, who were like animated, the power of the spirit of this little child. The spirit is very strong in children, which is why they light the whole room up.
Right.
It doesn't matter. A child starts to giggle and laugh and belly laugh in a restaurant, the whole restaurant's laughing.
Right.
Or an airplane or whatever. So there are various agents, or how should I say, fonts, taps for this type of energy. Our job is to find it. People, who really do espouse a useful to them practice of, say, Roman Catholicism or whatever, they have the sacraments, the sacred moments, sacramental moments, which is where an opportunity for grace, if that's your thing. We talk about selfless service in recovery and in other spiritual practices, Hindu practices, seva, selfless service, doing for others. You go to a meditation place and there'll be something you have to do, even though you're paying to stay in this retreat or whatever, you have service to give, because that is one of the sacramental ways that we give others. We have Habitat for Humanity, soup kitchen, people that volunteers. My wife's an educator and a retired doctor, a dentist, and she works, in doing Meals on Wheels and other things, because it gives us the energy and it makes a certain relevance to our existence. In recovery, it's the alchemy of redemption in recovery is you take the. I say once, people say, "Why'd you get into working with addictions?" I said, "Well, because 12 years of my life, I don't have to explain it away in a resume. It's we take the darker stuff and we convert it, and it's all light. It's all light energy, whatever. So when I think of Reiki, I think of light. Most of the guided meditations will say, think of a golden light, think of a bright white light or a purple light, whatever, healing lights."
Well, it's one of those things that when I talk about spirituality, when clients bring it up, I've taken more of a passive approach on spirituality in my practice. But I've had this many times where people say, "Well, I don't believe in anything. I'm an agnostic." And I said, "Well, that's a belief system.
Yeah.
That means that when you're dead, you're dead.
Yeah.
And maybe perhaps doing the best you can while you're here is a spiritual practice, instead of thinking when I'm dead, that's not a spiritual practice. In fact, I think it means you can live the moment, you can live the present. And it usually makes people light up and say, "Oh, I never thought about it that way." I think that once you think about spirituality as not having, and you can have one God, you can have 50 gods, goddesses, as you said too. I agree with you. If you've ever seen the movie Dogma, Alanis Morissette, she's Canadian as a god. I think that makes sense to me.
It's a good move.
But I think that I tell people to watch that movie if they're like spiritually done. I think that Dogma is probably one of those movies that also woke up my spiritual side. But I just wanted to say that a spiritual practice doesn't have to be meditating for 2 hours or going to church service every day. It could be so much more than that. And a spiritual practice is just not what it's cracked up to be. And that connection. And I was thinking about the other part that we were talking about. Rarely does someone do like the Meal on Wheels or any type of volunteer work that leave there and go grumpy, because the energy just makes you feel happy.
Yeah.
And I think that that's something I wanted to mention.
Well, it's the atheists and agnostics. The literature of AA, of recovery, certainly speaks to that. Is that it doesn't require. We don't come in there looking for theology, but that's not what it's about. And a lot of the arcane literature that organization has, it was written back when that was more the language. I mean, I can remember once when Bishop Sheen had one of the most popular TV shows on, and he was a captivating speaker and an inspiring speaker. But it's atheism is someone basically says there is no God. That's a belief. I believe there's no God. That's the ultimate left brain or head philosophy on that. But they do believe that there are things greater that they can't explain. Again, mystery leads to discovery. And I think there's a chapter or a phrase, or how should I say, a concept that is put forth in that literature of recovery that speaks to that, to the agnostics who are doubters. They don't know. They say, I don't know. Is that we talk about electricity. Now, again, I was going to be a nuclear physicist in my mind. And I understand intellectually the concept of electricity is the electrons running along. I can't really discern between AC and DC, direct current and alternating current, but I have a faith in it. And I believe even an atheist has a faith in greater things like electricity. I may not believe in electricity, but I plug my phone in. Oh, yeah, I have that background. I plug my phone in. I trust that it will light the lamp. It will charge my phone. So I have a faith in something greater than me, a power greater than me, which we call electricity.
Right.
And so, and much like remotely, Nikola Tesla actually invented a way to transmit electricity through the air and not through power lines. He was pretty much a rock star genius. Many of his ideas were co-opted by commercial ventures, mostly Thomas Edison, but whatever. There have been people that have been able to think outside of the box. And if we can do that, we don't do it with our head. We align it a little bit with our heart. And I believe that the Reiki energy, the heart chakra, is one of the most powerful. That is where a lot of this really connects us to what we know, what we came from. I will go psychiatric here for a second. No, that didn't sound right. Excuse me, I got to take the meds, and I'll be right back. But
all right.
Yeah, it's the great godfather of recovery and psychiatrically is Carl Jung, and he had a relationship with one of the AA founders, Bill Wilson. And Jung's concept was of the collective unconscious, which is we're all part of. We can tap into this compendium of knowledge, conscious knowledge that fuels humanity. And he was a real free thinker like that, and very different than some of the other psychiatrists of his day. Interestingly, they were all neurologists. They were all brain doctors, essentially. And then they got off in this other side because it was probably of interest to them. It was interesting. My job is when I meet people, and different people have been led to me. As I said, my practice has shifted from addiction medicine, dual diagnosis medicine, and trauma work to wellness, aging, retiring, grief and loss. I do a ton of grief work with people, and sometimes, and I help people to die. And that's been something I've done. I've had a number of people that have come to me because they know they were dying. Things like of ALS, which is a dreadful disease.
Yes.
But I watched someone die beautifully because he came to me before he got bad. He said, I need to know more. Don't you love that? About what? About the spirit business. And I've been a Presbyterian all my life, which I don't even know what a Presbyterian is. But he said, and that all made sense to me, but it doesn't make sense now. And honest to God, this man blossomed, and he died a beautiful, the physicality of those types of degenerative diseases is a loss of dignity. So it takes a tremendous amount of spiritual well-being and, how shall I say, spirituality to embrace that the vehicle is eroding. Entropy is taking over the host vehicle for the spirit, but I still have something that I value here. And for him, it was granddaughters, a little granddaughter who just lit him up. He would just sit often on Zoom and watch her, but she had that energy. He was like another person in the room sometimes. So, but this is what has been led to me by whatever forces there are. I have theories, but I can remember once when I was a very young man, I said, I don't know much. I said, but when I do die, I have questions. I have a long list of questions. I didn't really think that many of them would get answered before, but all it takes is an open mind and a faith in something, a curiosity, and things will start to make sense. The Buddha said, don't take anything I say at truth simply because of respect for me. Figure it out yourself. Challenge it. Understand it. Study it. It has to coincide. Truth has to coincide with your core belief in it, your core sensibility about it. I think that was his word, sensibility about it. Right. And so, we come in here, Buddha also said that, no one else can walk your path. You have to walk your own path. And he said that the path is going to be difficult in the earth school, and that some days all you can do is put one foot in front of another. And if you believe, and I believe this is what the heart does for us. The heart gives us our direction. We follow the
Right.
heart, and then you just keep walking uphill in the rain, dark, whatever, sliding backwards a little bit. You just keep walking.
I think that what I've loved about Buddhism and what embraced me is that even I had the preconception that Buddha was enlightened at every single moment of his life. And that's exactly what I think when people tell me that, I'm like, well, I had the same preconception. That's the good news. The bad news is I'm going to break your preconception, because Buddha would tell you that that's not true. And Buddha was a man. He was not a god and does not want to be revered as a god. And he has become a symbol and a figure in the life of Buddhism. But it's realizing that Buddha says something that I think what really intrigued me. He says, we all have it within ourselves. And you don't need to be a god. You don't need to be a powerful person. You don't have to be a weak person. You got to be nothing else but just be. And it's all within yourself. And I think that's what really attracted me to that belief system.
He was a very interesting figure. And we know actually quite a bit about him, even though this was like 5th century. Was it 5th century BC? It was 5th century, I think. And
I want to say 4th or 5th. Yes.
Yeah, he was a prince, a very wealthy prince. And somewhere near his 30th birthday, he got curious about what was beyond the palace walls, and he walked out and did not return. And for the rest of his 50 years of existence after that, he had nothing. All he had was what he learned and what he knew. And every single meal he got was at the kindness of others. Every shelter he received was at the kindness of others. And so by doing that, he opened himself up to receive and then inspire people to practice loving kindness toward him. And right. They're, it's the same as Muhammad and Christ and all of these beings, these extraordinary enlightened beings that have walked. I've only met one enlightened being who was a guru, and she was magic of a discipline, a Hindu-based meditation discipline. Having been in her presence and felt that energy, it's the extraordinary thing is that she was. I was one of 5,000 people in the course of a weekend that were around her, and she was totally revered by most of these people and adored, and she was totally unaffected by it. And I could tell stories about how I became a believer of this extraordinary gift that she had to inspire, and the energy field that she had, which was extraordinary. These people that have this capacity, they're here by design to assist others, but they practice what they preach. The Buddha did is that he eschewed all of the trappings that he had, and he got really curious about what else is there in life besides this. For people of my generation, that you hear Peggy Lee saying, "Is that all there is?" And people, whoever's watching this, go, "Peggy who?" But look it up, Google it, Peggy Lee.
Peggy Lee, yes. Yeah. I think that there's going to be a lot of Google.
Is this all there is? Because it's the opportunity to take a chance and learn. Because the same old. I think one of the reasons we have this extraordinary thing on the planet where the first $1 billion that some people acquire is not enough. Maybe the next billion will make me happy. And this pursuit of wealth, and I guess now that there's a competition to see who can be the first trillionaire. At some point you're going to leave, and this journey will be over. If $1 billion made people happy, I don't think they'd need a second billion. Just saying. It is so much more to it. And so that's the Buddha taught that, is they get curious about what there is when you're not distracted by so much wealth or so much of this world. And I used to do a group actually in the day hospital once on abundance. Is that abundance, whatever you have an abundance of, whether it is what we consider positive or negative, there is one thing you're tasked with, and that's management. You must manage abundance. And I actually used to have a briefcase with paper in it, but I would say everyone thinks here that $100,000 would be perfect. But, oh yeah, yeah. And so I would take this briefcase with $100,000 in cash in there and I put it on someone's lap. Who the most enthusiastic that would make. I said, okay, you now have $100,000 in there. They wanted to look. I said, don't open it. You have to believe me. But what are you going to do now? Well, and I said, you notice the people in the room are looking at that briefcase? And then they started riffing on that as to what, do you feel safe with it? No, I got to get my $100,000 out of here before someone, and people started saying, could you just spare me 20 grand?
Right.
I just need, my kid is sick. And it
Right.
became this amazing group of, something that everyone in the room could have a consensus. It was a wonderful thing that could happen to them, suddenly changed their trajectory. It took them out of treatment. I know a kid that was in treatment for cocaine and he needed to be. And he was a young married guy and his wife hit the lottery for a couple of $1 million. Someone in the town in which you practice. And they begged her not to tell him. Of course, she drove right up to the rehab and told him. And I think the story is it didn't take him very long, the two of them, to lose that money. And it distracted him from his path. So this kind of capitalistic view that money is good. Money is a tool. Money is a certain level of power, but power can be very distracting.
Just a reminder, finding your way through therapy. It's been almost an hour, Pat.
Good
Pat
Lord.
Rice sitting with me.
I told you.
It's great. I love talking about this. And I think about one of the stories that I don't do the same thing as you. I don't do groups, but one of the stories I explain when people are too worried about the future. I said, what the problem is with the millionaire? He's already thinking about his second, never appreciating the first one he got. So learning to appreciate what we have, to me, is part of that abundance and spiritual belief system, because we are lucky in some ways. And yes, we all have tragedies in our own right, in our own lives, but we have the ability to kind of, literally kind of like be happy. Not everyone, but a lot of all my clients have a roof over their heads. They can eat as much as they want, reasonably speaking. And that's a richness that a lot of people on this planet don't have.
It's like we talk about first world problems, but it's the root word of I mentioned the word earlier, grace. That is one of the terms that people use for this divine energy that permeates everything and kind of runs everything. Well, people ask me all of the time when I did public speaking on addictions and recovery and all of that. I did tons of it and grand rounds and all of that. And it's the most common question, whether it was clinicians or the general public, was, how do you know when someone has it? They have that they have a chance at changing everything. And I go back to what Jung had talked about, which was the conversion experience. And we call it a spiritual awakening in 12-step recovery. But it's the moment at which someone stops feeling like they're being deprived of something and thus missing something positive, where they start feeling gratitude, grace that enters, and they start feeling grateful that they're being spared something negative. That's the conversion experience. And that's what gets people past the grief of the next million or whatever. I believe it was the fabulous, the guy that wrote all the fables, Aesop's fables.
Yes.
Which are just another version of a morality play. But he once said a wonderful quote that often gets attributed to Buddha, that gratitude is what makes what you have today enough. And we've kind of lost that. And I believe, and I'll pontificate for a minute or opine, is that people keep saying that there's a movement to try to make the national religion of America Christianity. That's not true. We already have a national religion. It's called capitalism.
Yes.
And capitalism is ruthless, and it's about making money. It's about the pursuit of that. And there's a bait and switch in there in marketing terms, is that your capitalism trains people: if you are successful, you will be happy. They are mutually exclusive very often. Is that very, very, very powerfully successful people are not happy often. They're distracted. They have a management problem. I had a fellow that came to me, a fabulously successful guy. I won't give too much information, but his problem is that he had about 6 houses all over the planet, and he was getting besieged all the time by the people who were managing these properties. And so his strategy in one session was, I must have been divinely inspired, because I said, well, who likes these houses if you don't? He said, well, I like 2 of them, and the other 5, I have a kid that likes this one, a kid that likes that one. I said, well, why don't you just deed them all to the kids now and let them take care of them? You can visit them. It's the objectivity of sitting in the chair.
Yes.
And he looked at me and he goes, that's brilliant. And he did it. And he had the 2 houses he liked to live in. And then he gave all of us, the kids, all the skier, got the lodge or whatever. And it's a simple bit of life coaching in that moment. But he was burdened by all of this success and affluence. He just needed to lighten his load. There's a famous book now making the circles called Drop the Rock.
Yes, I've heard of that.
It's like, we can carry around something all day. Again, a gold bar. Wow, that's something else. Try to carry it all day.
Right.
That's probably one of the parables of one of the stories that all of the wise beings tell. And we try to unburden people. They come into our offices and tell us, well, this is what I need. This is what I want. And we ask the magic question, what are you willing to do to get it?
Right.
And then because we often have solutions, because not that we invented this stuff, we just have paid attention and we watch people fail doing everything else. And when someone says that, I say, okay, well, I suggest you do. Well, I can't do that. And I said, I can't help you then. Because, if you can get out of the zero sum where it's all or nothing, and you can just embrace that there's a little something we don't know, the mystery of the universe, whatever. And I think that allows people, one thing that is the most important thing in everything that you and I do, Steve, and people like us, is that my job is to try to relight the hope pilot light.
Relight the hope.
Because we see people that come in and life, and God, COVID and everything's exhausted people. And they get weakened. The brightest people, the light weakens. The battery dims, the oil gets low. Whatever it is, the source of it. Well, for the spirit, that source is to tap into divine energy. And you can do it by meditation, spiritual practice, breath work, breathing. Let me plug somebody else's book, because someone that is important to me, a counselor, suggests I read this. It's a book called Breath by James Nestor, Nestor. And really, it's a scientific approach to it. It's kind of like the 50-year upgrade of Herb Benson's the relaxation response. It was part of the Deaconess. He probably ran the Deaconess Mind Body Clinic way back in the 70s. And out of it came the understanding that the way you change the chemistry of the human body from that of stress and anxiety is breathing.
One of the things that I would say, you talk about relight the hope. One of the things that I talk about to many clinicians is that all we have to do is make people feel a little better. As a therapist, I learned that on the crisis team. Even though on the crisis team, you don't get to know the person. If people left feeling slightly better, whether they went to the hospital or not, and they had that little relight the hope, I like a lot better. We've done our job as a therapist, even if it's just a little bit. And I wanted to just put that in. And as we wrap up, you had your parting words, and I wanted to hear them.
Okay. This is what I remember Dick used to tell me. Dick Flack used to say that he was a wordsmith. He loved the origin of words. And enthusiasm, which we talk about when that hope battery gets bright again, the light comes on, we have enthusiasm. And enthusiasm is from the Greek entheos, from God. It's divine energy. And he used to always talk about spirituality. And he put up spirituality on a board and divide it from spirit and uality. And he'd cross out spirit and say, we don't talk about that. We talk about self, our sense of self-help and all of that. So it's self-uality. And then he would say, if you take uality and just put a Q in front of it, that's quality. And so it's a really dramatic visual.
Yeah.
Is that, what spirituality is how do I feel about me based upon what I do, my practice. He also said that from the word spirit, spirituality, comes from the Latin word spiritus, which is not soul. That's animus or anima,
Right.
animation and all of that. The word spiritus means breath.
Right.
So literally the most spiritual thing you can do as a human being by definition is breathe. And when people get stressed and occupied, they hold their breath. Everything's going out. If my computer crashes on me, I sputter, like this. And so it's a moment is to just learn how to breathe. And most of the spiritual practices focus on breath work. Certainly meditation does. So my parting shot is that I've said this 1,000 times. If I've said it once, is that when you don't know what to do next, breathe.
Right.
Just breathe and breathe. And if you're really, really, really upset, move your body. A wise old person said, when a troubled human being walks, the angels talk to you. Whatever that means to you. But when your legs are tired, your mind won't be bothering you as much. It's the way I think to turn the volume down on that itty-bitty committee.
Well, Pat, I will finish too by saying that, first of all, thank you for everything. The one thing that I've been meaning to talk about is when you talk about spirituality, if you ever look into the Eightfold Path to Buddhism, and one of them is right livelihood, I think you hit that one out of the park already. And it's one of those things that I tell people that my job, one thing I know is that I'll never regret my job. And I think that, Pat, not only because of everything you've done for everyone else, what all other people you've inspired, and I know you're going to inspire people on this podcast, including me, frankly. Right livelihood doesn't even do justice on how well you do your job. So I wanted to thank you for your time today.
Well, thank you. I'll just finish with one thing. This was told to me, and I've said it to everybody that I've ever worked with, is that we're tasked with one reality, one truth, and that is that as providers and people that want to be helpful to somebody else, we're going to have the authentic energy to inspire others. We must take our own advice. So we're not supposed to put the bumper sticker on the car that says, take my advice, I'm not using it.
Right.
So it's, and if we do that, I think then and the other thing is that we're not responsible in trying to be helpful to someone else for outcome, just effort.
I think that I'm going to leave it at that and say thank you very much, Pat. And
thank you, Steve.
I hope we have this conversation continue offline and maybe even one day come back and talk about it more.
I'd be honored as always. It's great, and I really appreciate what you're doing. This is you've been a pioneer in a lot of this telehealth and everything in the area, and we've all learned greatly from you. So thank you. I don't think I could have zoomed my way into a different practice modality here doing this without guys like you. So and gals, thanks.
Thank you, and I'll talk to you very soon. I can't wait to reconnect. But thank you.
Okay.
Well, this concludes episode 80 of Finding Your Way Through Therapy. Pat Rice, thank you and congratulations. Most downloaded episode. I truly, truly appreciate it. Episode 81 will be my favorite or favorites episode of the year. If you've been following me a little bit here and also on my social media, you have noticed that I've done the 12 days of Christmas, so to speak. You can call it the 12 days of holidays if you wish, of different favorite episodes I had throughout the year. But episode 81, there will be a winner, and I will share that on the next episode.
Hello, this is Pat Rice. Steve Bissonnette asked me to comment upon my experience of recording a podcast for him. I've done 3 to date, and 1 more coming in another month or so, and I've really enjoyed it a lot. The synergy of thought and curiosity and ideas and insight with Steve, who has as curious a mind as I, has been very rewarding. It's effortless in my experience, and actually something I really look forward to. As I've said before, the fact that anyone else has any interest of it is really humbling and rewarding to me. I've noticed that my former students, many of them, I send them the podcasts and they find them a nice way of reconnecting, and it's done that for me as well, to be able to reconnect to many. So I look forward to the next one, and whoever might hear this or listen to it, I thank you for your interest, and take good care.